It's now my pleasure to invite today's moderator and panelists up to the stage. We are so excited to have this incredible group of experts here with us this morning and based right here in our community. First of all, we have Stacy Jackson, the Department Chair for Economics and Business at Hope College. Stacy will be our moderator this morning. And joining Stacy will be Jennifer Owens, the President of Lakeshore Advantage, great friend of the West Coast Chamber, as well as Dr. Stephen Smith, the Professor of Economics at Hope College, and Jay Wortley, retired from the State of Michigan Department of Treasury. Please join me in giving a warm West Coast welcome to our panelists.
So quiet. Hey, everyone.
It is quiet. Good morning. It's supposed to be a loud good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
If you'll look behind you, we have a group of great students sitting right up there.
Hey, Hope kids.
As well. Well, we're happy to be here, and I get the joy of moderating this discussion as well. A couple of things I'll just point out to get started and at least give you a little bit of a preview. We will talk about the local economy, including West Michigan as well as the state. We'll talk nationally about what's going on, as well as some things on a global. I don't think we can get away without talking about China in a global perspective as well, and we have plenty of expertise sitting at the table. A couple of things that I'll just start with before we get going is that I don't think anyone expected we would be where we are. In fact, most people, after the recession, after the downturn, thought the recovery would be pretty similar to past recoveries. The idea is you have a debt hangover. I think it was Rogan that stated that early on, and looking at past recoveries, and that you just work your way out of debt, and eventually you'd have unemployment starting to decrease and get to about 5% or so, and the idea was interest rates would rise and get to about 4%, and none of that's happened. And it's been a long time, and then we had this incredible year in the stock market, and so I'm sure at least some people. I had one son who heard about the forum last night. One of my two sons who both got engaged, I just mentioned this in my table, within 3 weeks of each other, and they're both getting married next year, and I'm so glad they're not going to be the bride. Yeah. I should restate that I'm so glad, my checkbook is so glad that that's not the case. But he was saying, I just keep wondering whether I should just pull my money out and wait, like, is it over? Do I sit back? He has all these questions. So I don't know if we'll answer that specifically, but we will have a forecast at the end as well. So Jennifer, I'll start with you and just talk about locally. Tell us, what should we be thinking about when we think about the economy locally?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of my forecasts are right here in front of you. So our team collects data from 100 businesses. And really what we're seeing locally is growth. 73% of our companies are looking to grow in the next year. But that growth is a little bit smaller in terms of jobs and investment. So on average, we're looking at about 25 jobs and then $7 million in investment. So we're seeing a lot of companies really invest significantly in automation, technology, and really it's directly related to the biggest barrier to growth, which is talent, access to talent. Unemployment rates continues to be one of the lowest in the state of Michigan. So if you can't find the people to do the work, you figure out a way to automate it. And so talent, followed by tariffs are really the two keys that we see.
Tell us, I mean, this may be obvious, but why are tariffs so important in West Michigan?
Well, we make things here, obviously, and a lot of the components we make, our products, have many pieces to them, and a lot of companies are importing from China and exporting goods to China. So having those challenges and those tariff sanctions has caused a pretty big hit to many of our manufacturers who have pretty low profit margins. And so tariffs, not only in the manufacturing space, but also in the ag space, have caused some big pain points.
What would you say is the percent of companies, or if you haven't, I don't know if it's on there.
1 in 3. So 1 in 3 companies that we talk to are reporting negative impacts from tariffs.
unpack a little bit when you talked about the workforce,
Yep.
because we have a couple of interesting things going on generationally with the workforce.
Right.
So how does that look for West Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our demographics, probably in the next 10 years, a third of our workforce will potentially retire out. And we're not replacing that at the level we wanted to. Baby boomers, it's hitting. But what we're seeing is some of our baby boomers staying longer in their careers, which is kind of not allowed us to hit as much as we thought we would from the generational challenge. So we have a third of the workforce retiring out and roughly about 15% coming in. We have to look for ways to attract talent in, keep the kids that we have here. All of you Hope kids up there, please start your careers here. We need you. We really do.
Starts with a free breakfast today.
Yes.
So let's talk about this, and Steve and Jay, you may jump in on comments on this as well, is that this is this interesting dynamic. We have a very talented particular work ethic with boomers, despite the saying, okay, boomer, right? Still, and yet we can't seem to replace them with the same kind of talent. Is there any examples of that you see in the region that you'd...
Well, I think we can't replace them, but what we need to do is look at creative ways to keep them in the workforce longer. And so we have a lot of companies who are looking at phasing out boomers over time, so 3 to 5 years for them to retire so they can cross-train those skills. So I think from an employer perspective, being creative to keep your potential retirees in the workforce as long as possible is going to be key. I'm going to pick on Jay a little bit here. So Jay, head economist for the state of Michigan, lived in Lansing, chose to retire here in Holland, and I think an untapped potential workforce could be people like Jay who may want to consult, who might want to.
So we're going to start at $100, and we're going to see what we can get.
But great talent in the retiree pool, and we can't count them out completely. How can we keep them engaged in a way that makes sense?
I'll just add, when I retired, when I worked for the state government, I couldn't phase out. It was a drop dead day, like I told my wife, 1 week I was meeting with the governor. The next week I couldn't even get in the building. It was over. It was done. So it was a real abrupt ending. It would have been nice if I could have phased out.
Well, I'm pointing to this creativity. How can we creatively on both ends think about retirement? And there's a lot of retirees, some of the retirees, back to debt hangover, a lot of the retirees are staying because of what happened.
Oh, absolutely. Their 401ks took a huge hit and just now are starting to recover.
So now they have creative contracts or work arrangements or those kind of things might still be very appealing.
I'd like to jump in on this point as well. I don't think Holland has seen the last of the boomers. And when you look at it demographically across the United States, the peak of the baby boom era was 1957, when the largest cohort of babies in U.S. history was born. And those people had just now turned 62. And so I think, although Holland is a little bit of a well-kept retirement secret, I think there's a strong likelihood that we'll get, still to come, a substantial increase in the number of younger boomers who are retiring into this area. And I'm hopeful that many of them, in fact, will remain active in the workforce. And I would expect that in the kind of diversified, vibrant economy that we have around us here.
That would be great. Huge.
Yeah. Some of that requires being creative about thinking about where you look for the talent that you need, and also for the people retiring to think about those things in creative ways as well. And I saw an example. I went in True Value the other day and they had an opening, and I was having an okay day at Hope, and I was thinking it was a part-time, I should say it was a part-time role. I think it was being helpful on the floor and a lot of other things.
Did the benefits look good?
Well, on that day, I really didn't care as much about benefits. But my point is that I think what happens as you work a long career, and a lot of even senior executives out of companies come out and they're looking for something different to do, a different arrangement, and it's a little bit of this matchmaking of trying to how to connect with those people, create forums like the wonderful job that the Chamber does of bringing people together. But this is a challenge because it won't continue, and if we get through retirements, then we're going to have problems that don't have directly to do with the economy. It's a workforce problem.
And I think also on the talent side too is our community has 30% private sector manufacturing workforce, which is 3 times higher than the national average. And the typical manufacturing employee has some type of advanced education beyond high school because they're working with technology, they're programming machinery and equipment. So I think the one thing that we have to also share with our kids is you have to be a continuous learner. It doesn't stop at high school. The days of going to high school, working on a manufacturing shop floor and being set for the rest of your life aren't there anymore. So continuing to raise our education rate and encouraging people to be lifelong learners is going to be huge.
So we think a little bit of a supply problem here in terms of the workforce. I know that if you guys haven't gone to the annual event for Lakeshore Advantage, it's a great event that really gives you a snapshot of what's going on locally. But you have awards and focus on trying to help students or schools do that. Tell us, how do those work? Is there a lot of capacity for more students in our region to have more technical training?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited about GRCC citing a potential new Holland campus at the West Shore Mall. Muskegon Community College has also put a big stake in the ground in Grand Haven. So I think having more access to that training nearby is going to be huge for us as well. And having kids be able to get to it quickly.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Jennifer. What if you mentioned earlier about tariffs, so we'll just turn to Stephen, who grew up in Hong Kong, and I'll stop with that. That's intriguing enough. And a lot of his focus, research-wise, is on Asia and looks at trade issues. So tell us, I'll give you the sophisticated question, what's up with China?
Boy, are we in an interesting situation with China right now? Oh my goodness. Tomorrow, the Phase 1 trade deal will be signed at the White House. And this is almost certainly good news. But it's tricky to think about it because we don't actually have the text of it yet. We've got press releases from the Commerce Department, but we don't have the actual deal in front of us. Now, according to the Commerce Department, it's going to be great.
Enough said.
And trust the government, right?
We've been promised that it's going to have some important provisions in it that deal with the genuinely significant problem that U.S. firms have had in China of intellectual property protection. That's been a big issue. It's been entirely appropriate for the administration to try to address that. It's something of a scandal that earlier administrations didn't give it the attention that was really necessary on this. And so hopefully there'll be some meaningful agreements on intellectual property. There's going to be some loosening of restrictions on U.S. service firms, financial service firms' ability to operate in China. And potentially that's a huge boon for the U.S. economy because our best market opportunities in China, in addition to some particular manufacturing areas, are in services, financial services, insurance, and so on. It'd be terrific for U.S. firms to be able to compete more in the China market. There's also apparently going to be some straight-up promises by the Chinese government to spend tens of billions of dollars more on U.S. agricultural output, and that could really actually help West Michigan. We're in addition to being above average in terms of our manufacturing output here, we're above the national average in terms of our agricultural output. We're a really diversified place. We've got significant agriculture here, and so meaningful increases in China's purchases of our agricultural goods would be all to the good.
Yeah, 277% more than the national average is our agricultural concentration. So
that's a bigger number, though.
Pretty huge.
Yeah. I think the problem, though, the historic problem has, and this isn't to put a damper on what you just said, but the historic problem with China has not been creating a deal. The problem has been enforcing the deal. And when we talk about intellectual property, this becomes extraordinarily hard to actually implement. So
it really does. It really does. And it's now a really important issue because our two economies, China and the United States, are now connected in ways that will be really, really hard and costly to disentangle. And I'm not actually necessarily recommending that. It would be harmful for both of our economies at this point. So figuring out a good mechanism for holding the Chinese to their agreements is going to be essential. A piece of the agreement with China apparently is an agreement to continue meeting with them, having working group meetings with them twice a year on trade policy issues and enforcement and adjudication and dispute settlement issues arising from this agreement. And that's a sign to the good. The administration, when it first came into office in early 2017, was adamant that it did not want working group relationships with Chinese counterparts. So this is actually really good news. But the reality is it is simply going to be hard to enforce this with China. Their economic system is arranged on a fundamentally different basis than ours. The system depends upon state ownership of most of the major firms in the economy. Those firms are heavily subsidized. Ironically, in pushing for them to liberalize their economy and eliminate the subsidies, we're actually asking the Chinese to do things that would serve them so well long term. But the politics of the Communist Party dictate that they protect their political bases, that they protect those large firms, and so they're unwilling to do the kinds of sustained liberalization that we most would want them to do, and which ironically would most help them.
So a couple of things. One is, about 20 years ago or so is when I was able to start working in China, and the sentiment was, this question was, I should say, how long will relations be warm? How long will we have an opportunity to keep doing this? But the reality is, this is a leveling of the world's economies, right? That this is an appetizer to a conversation that is not going to stop anytime soon.
That is so right. I've had the privilege of taking groups of Hope students over to China to visit U.S. firms there, visit Chinese firms there, and try to understand the breadth and nature of the economy and the whole situation. And I tell my students, kind of joking, but kind of for real, that they get 90% of the value added of a visit to China in the 30 minutes when they're driving into town from the airport. Because on that drive, you see the extent of the economy. You see miles and miles of 40-story high apartment buildings. You see miles and miles of factories. You see the population, you see the crowded streets, and it drives home that China really is actually a bigger economy than the United States in many ways. China isn't going away, and one way or another, the U.S.'s own economic future now has to take into account China, and we're not accustomed to that. But that is the reality.
That's the trip from the Shanghai airport.
Trip in from the Shanghai airport, trip in from the Beijing airport, trip in from the Shenzhen airport.
Population a little bit too. Like put into consideration the population. You said there was a mid-sized city in China that was the same population as all the state of Michigan.
Yeah, like Wuhan. How many people have been to Wuhan? Some people might have. Yeah,
Small.
few. Yeah.
So
cities like Wuhan are bigger than any of our cities. They're enormous, and so cities you've never heard of in China are bigger than what we think are the biggest. What we
Bigger than the state of
Bigger than our
Michigan.
bigger than the state of
More
Michigan,
populous than
right?
our state.
Bigger than the state of Michigan, and so
Yeah.
it's shocking to just realize the staying power of this conversation. It's not. It's the beginning.
And by the
of the
way, I mean, the
conversation.
Chinese consumer is great for our employers as well. I mean, many people sell into the Chinese market products as well. Exporting of ag is so key. They have so many people, but they don't have the ability to grow the products that we can grow and export. So there's a lot of great benefits from that relationship.
It's in everybody's best interest for that relationship to work. Any other comments before I change topics on what's up with China?
no, I think we're good for a while. We might circle back to it. You know, I think it's greatly to the credit of the manufacturing firms in West Michigan that they have, many of them have made significant investments in China. The Chinese market is, historically has been growing, and it's important that we have a presence there. There's no question that this has helped the viability of manufacturing in Michigan and in West Michigan in particular. But we're in potentially for a rocky moment. China's growth is slowing down, and I can say more about that later, perhaps.
Yeah. So just to keep at least people a little apprehensive on their seat, I'll use the Trump word for a minute. Is that the Trump tax plan? We've talked in the past. The discussions would have been around the Affordable Care Act, and there's mixed results. In fact, a lot of people now on both sides who thought there were horrible things with the Affordable Care Act see things that have happened that have made them happy, and the worst and the best, actually, unfortunately, the worst or the best, they're both not really happening, but there's some good things that are happening. With the Trump tax plan, we are starting to see whether or not any of the things that were promised have happened or not, and so response to that?
May I speak to that, or Jay, do you want to?
Go ahead.
In many ways, the Trump tax plan that was initiated, passed in 2017 and initiated in 2018, remains the signature piece of policy that the administration has passed. And amazingly, I think this has flown under the radar of much of the mainstream press, but that law is working as advertised. The repatriation, the reduction in corporate income tax and the repatriation of U.S. profits from abroad that had been kind of dammed up and held abroad because of the high U.S. corporate tax rate, that really has worked. I've got a slide on this. Can we look at the tax slide for a second?
I don't see anything interesting about that slide.
Can you spot the year when the tax law was passed? This is U.S. firms' repatriation of profits from abroad to the U.S. economy, starting in 2018, but now in 2019 and into 2020. It looks like there's going to be more than $1 trillion. More than $1 trillion of profits repatriated back to the United States. That's only to the good in terms of U.S. investment. Trump sometimes is his own worst enemy. He said there was going to be $4 trillion worth of profit repatriation, but there's not that much profits abroad to repatriate. This is a trillion is a big win.
Yeah.
So why is it continuing to trend down?
Oh, the big burst happened in 2018, and now the flow is
it's going to normalize at a higher number. That's
it's going to
okay.
Right, normalize at a higher number.
So
Yeah,
Catch up.
Exactly.
Anything else when you look at the tax plan that's worth noting? I mean, this is clearly one element that's important.
So another piece of the tax plan that's really worth thinking about for Michigan and for West Michigan, I think, is the way it capped the state and local tax deductions. That's now hitting high tax states really hard. Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York in particular, California, to some extent Illinois as well. Their governors are really complaining about this because it's forcing those residents to pay the full to be taxed on the full amount of the state and local taxes they pay to their state governments. That's a kind of a secret weapon for a secret advantage for places like Michigan, which is going to be much more attractive now for retirees and other migrants from those high tax U.S. states. I predict that on the margin, that's definitely going to help West Michigan.
Maybe back to baby boomers who are going to continue to stay in the workforce and get the most out of their money and real estate prices.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're going to hit pause for a moment. We have on-the-ground reporters with microphones near you. I see Colleen over here to the left. All I'd ask is that you ask questions that we would like to answer.
And if we don't, we just say next.
If not, I reserve the right to ignore the question and just go next. Well, so truly, on any topic that we've talked about so far, if you have a follow-up question for our panelists, we've got one right here in the middle. That was part of the trick.
Hi, thank you.
Whoa.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. Good.
Can you speak to the tax plan, Trump's tax plan, as it relates to the national debt?
Yeah. Anybody want to talk? I think the question was the tax plan, and the question is it going to have any impact on national debt, or are these unrelated, or what's going to happen with the debt moving forward?
I heard Jeff Bezos was just going to pay off the debt.
Is that what it was? Yeah. The way I'm shopping at Amazon, I think it's going to work. Yeah.
And that's really nice of him.
Yeah, Jeff is a good guy. Mm-hmm.
You know, it is true that the growth in federal tax receipts has fallen since the tax plan went into effect. You know, these things are hard to discern. I think, at least in part, that the slowing of the growth rate of federal taxation has to do with the slowdown in U.S. growth in and of itself of the last 12 months or so. But the big driver of the current growth of the U.S. deficit is entitlements. Those are rising steadily. It's not even clear that we're going to be able, Congress, is going to be able to pass a 2% reduction in the food stamps program that would put that arise if we shorten the amount of time that able-bodied men without dependents can be on food stamps. We can't even pull the trigger on that kind of tiny, modest reform in the social safety net. So it's really on the expenditure side that we've got the driving force of the
this
budget deficit.
This is concurrent with unemployment being at a 50-year low.
Isn't that something in an era
you would expect to be able to change?
Right. You'd think this was the moment.
The total budget, the total allocated, should be able to drop.
Right. Yeah.
And there's still a lot of people who aren't on the unemployment rolls at all, right? That are out of the workforce for various reasons, and may that be a way to get them back to work, where we need able bodies.
Well, and I think there's clearly nervousness about exactly what's going on. As I mentioned earlier, the debt hangover was kind of the idea early on, is that if we'd get out of debt and we'd move towards a lower unemployment rate, maybe 5%, that we'd get the interest rates up. Larry Summers, who's now at Harvard, worked for both Clinton and Obama. He's had this secular stagnation idea that he borrowed actually from the 30s, trying to explain what was happening in the recession. And the idea, and it would go with the boomer piece, is that you have a demographic shift that you didn't expect, and that shift starts to protract what's happening. So people stay in the workforce longer. Other questions we get to issues of slack is that maybe we figured out how to use resources differently than we did before. Maybe there are people that are more employable than we ever knew they were, and somehow this expansion has caused us to see the ability. Maybe we've got a new normal. Maybe we're not our standard isn't going to be 4%, and in terms of interest, maybe all those things have shifted. So maybe it's possible that everyone does still, despite all the positives, doesn't know for sure if it's real. Back to Jennifer's question about this graph, right? Is it real or not? And everyone's frozen and still acting hesitant, like it's still the debt hangover, even though it's not. And I just like saying debt hangover. So it's a fun term.
Hey, Stacy, we have another question in the audience.
Wonderful.
Hi, my name is Aaron Thalenwood. I'm with the City of Holland and the West Michigan Regional Airport Authority. So kind of to piggyback off this conversation, we're talking about unemployment at all-time low. However, being a millennial and kind of feeling this firsthand, we're seeing a lot of multi-jobs, so people working 2 or 3 jobs. People of my generation aren't, I guess, seeing the economic advantages of prior generations, and it's kind of difficult to see that wage gap closing in the near term. So I'm kind of just curious what the projections are for wage growth in the region and what other policies are in place that we should be aware of.
And Jay, maybe we'll shift to you. Like in the state of Michigan, as the former senior economist under multiple governors, what is the sentiment of the population about growth? Where are we actually in terms of employment, and how does it look compared to the last 10 or 15 years?
Okay. Yeah, this great question, because before you can look forward, I mean, the topic of today's seminar or meeting is the economic forecast. But before you can look at the economic forecast, it's really important to know where you currently are and what's going on. And the best place to start to do that is to look at the U.S. economic climate right now. And we look at the U.S. first because what's going on in the U.S. economy has a direct bearing on what's going on in the state of Michigan and what's going on in Holland. Because overall economic activity in the nation has a strong influence on the underlying economic trends that are occurring at the state level and at the local level. So in terms of the national economy right now, the national economy is doing pretty good. The numbers, they're not super great, but they're not really bad either. They're kind of in the middle. If you look at the broadest measure of economic activity that we have, and that's a real gross domestic product, or real GDP, which is the measure of the total value of all the final goods and services produced by the economy. It's growing. The latest data we have is for the third quarter of 2019. It was up 2.4% through the first 3 quarters of 2019. And that's pretty good growth. The average during the current expansion is about 2.5% growth. So we're right about where we have been for the last 10 years or so. So that's not bad. The major factors underlying that growth, first major factor is consumer spending. Consumer spending is really solid right now. Primarily because consumers are feeling pretty good about the economy. And if you could put up a slide on consumer sentiment. This shows the index for consumer sentiment. This tracks it back through, let's see, January of 2007. This is an index that is put together by the University of Michigan, and it measures how consumers are feeling about the economy. And for the past, currently in the past couple of years, consumers, this index is very high. Consumers are feeling good about the economy. And when consumers are feeling good about the economy, they're more apt to spend money. And overall consumer spending accounts for about 2/3 of economic activity. So what consumers are doing has a big impact on the economy. So consumer spending right now is kind of driving the economy. Why are consumers feeling good about the economy right now? Well, there's several factors. First, obviously, the labor market. If people want a job, chances are right now they can find a job. And if they don't like their job, chances are they can go and find another job. So job security is pretty good right now. Wages are edging up. And so consumers are feeling good about their incomes, or at least better about their incomes. Inflation is low. Don't have to worry about inflation right now. And the stock market is doing very well. And from the end of 2018 to the end of 2019, the stock market, as measured by the S&P 500, was up almost 29%. And so that means people that are invested in the stock market, their wealth is increasing. When people's wealth is increasing, again, they're more apt to spend. So consumer spending is going really good right now, and that's basically driving the economic activity right now and the growth. One other factor that is kind of pulling back a little bit from the growth in consumer spending is the manufacturing sector. Things are not looking real good in manufacturing right now, due in part to the trade wars that we're experienced with China, and the uncertainty around those trade wars. Manufacturing feels uncertain about what's going on. They're cautious, and they have to step back and take a look at, should I make this investment or not? If they're not sure what's going to happen tomorrow, then chances are they're not going to make that investment in new plant or new equipment. And so right now, investment by businesses has declined for the last 2 quarters in real terms. And so that's pulling back a little bit from the growth on consumer spending. And, but still, overall, the economy is doing pretty well right now.
If we look at that impact on Michigan, to the question as well, is our unemployment, is our employment looking similar or different? You made a comment when we had talked earlier about whether we've actually recovered or not in Michigan. And I think this is the same. When someone says 29% growth, I don't know about everybody else in the room, but that's exciting. But the comparison is, where would I have been if this thing did not happen, right? And for a lot of people, they look at the 29% growth, and if they look at their retirement funds, they look and they say, I am still not where I would have been. And this is the protracted engagement in the workforce as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we are right now, our net population in the region is higher than it was back in 2009, but it took us a long time to recover that net migration and those people. What I would say, from our perspective, we did lose a lot of families out of the area, which also creates a long-term negative effect because those families are not coming back. There are a lot of mid-career families left to take jobs in the south, east, west, and their families are continuing to stay there. So, and our region is probably 10 times stronger than the rest of the state as well, but getting that positive net migration up is going to be key for us. We continue to see, at least statewide, a decline.
So this is on a migration level. There was an article, I can't remember if it was Atlantic Monthly or what it was, several years ago, and what it was showing was what happens if I'm in a community and I start to lose a job, and I'm going to raise my family there. That in a sense what happens is the loyalty's been broken. That is, the community's not taking care of me, and so then we move. And when I say we move, the whole family moves.
Right.
Do we move back?
Probably not.
And why not?
I think because you create connections, your kids are in school, you may find you like that area more. You got exposure. Part of our work is we went around to 4 different best-in-class communities and visited them and found out what makes them tick. And we visited a location of a local firm, which was cited by someone who was from here. Young man, 30s, mid-30s. He and his wife have 2 kids, 2 and 4. He's in Greenville, South Carolina. I asked him if he'd ever come back. He said no. No, this is home for us.
That's where he grew up.
This is home. And he grew up in Holland.
And then the grandparents now.
And the grandparents are still here, but we may lose the grandparents too. I mean, we could lose the grandparents too over time as well.
And so the impact on the community during the recession is that there's a broach in loyalty of some kind. I can't find work, I go elsewhere, and then the folks who are here are also looking, can my kids, if you have a family, work here or not? All those dynamics lie beneath whether or not what these migration patterns might be.
Yeah, and we also talked a little bit in our prep about housing and housing starts too, which back to the kind of millennial question, the cost of housing has gone way up, maybe not so much to the level of wages. And so when we look at housing starts as a way that, negatively impacts millennials, they're paying a lot more for less, which is another impact on their bottom line.
A little bit to the comment. The sentiment is we've had generation after generation that felt like they could do better than their parents, and that the current generation doesn't think this will be the case. So I don't know if this plays into this question about the local economy. I think you have one other slide in your deck. I want to, Keegan, could you take us to whether we actually, what's really happened since the recession, and is all this growth actually making it up or not?
Well, for Michigan, no, as a matter of fact. This shows the payroll employment in Michigan going back to 1995 through current year. And payroll employment is probably for Michigan, it's the best economic indicator we have. It's timely, it's a big employment number, and it gives a good indication of how the state as a whole is going. And payroll employment back in the 1990s, late 1990s, the economy was going great, and employment was growing great. And then in 2000, the dot-com tech bubble burst, and the Michigan and the national economy went into a recession, and our employment began to decline. Then the national economy pulled out of the recession, and their employment began to increase. In Michigan, we continued to decline. It looked like in 2005, 2006, we were estimating at the time that it looked like we were starting to bottom out and that things were going to turn around and we were going to start increasing again. But then the Great Recession hit us, and Michigan's employment began to decline even faster. And it plummeted. Between 2001 and 2010, Michigan lost 1 out of every 6 jobs we began with in 2001. Employment fell over that 10-year period by 17%. Michigan was in recession for a whole decade. They called it the one-state recession. We were the only state. We were unique. It's not always good to be unique, and we were unique.
When you look at this, it's not just that we had never recovered from 2000, that when this hits, as you noted, it gets worse. And if I'm reading this right, we still haven't recovered to be where we were before.
Correct. We've improved since 2011,
in the state.
And we picked up some jobs, but we're still about 250,000 jobs below where we were back in 2000.
And this may be for either of you, but some of this have to do with migration, because I know even at Hope College, we see the number of graduating seniors in the state of Michigan going down. So when you're dependent on graduates from the state of Michigan and the numbers going down because of migration to Sun States, a lot of it's to Sun States, is that relevant to this?
It's a factor, but it's bigger than that. I mean, we restructured primarily in the auto sector and got rid of jobs. And because we got rid of jobs, people were then forced to leave the state and migrate out.
I mean, as a region, our net migration is high. It's the highest in the state of Michigan, but we're still not tracking where best-in-class communities like Greenville, South Carolina are. So you can pull our region out of Michigan, and we're still very strong, high net migration, high wage growth, high population, but we're surrounded by a state that's still struggling in a lot of ways. And so we can be an island unto ourselves, but we also have to continue to pull the entire state up.
Well, and this gets to this whole mix we've been talking about, the number of boomers in the region, will they stay employed, the number of technically skilled graduates from high school, all these things have to come together if you're going to have the right kind of net productivity and engagement. Let's get another question or two.
Make my way over there.
Would you share your thoughts as to whether we're living at a time of a global mega shift beyond industrialization into an age that is driven by digital technology and artificial intelligence, and if so, what's the impact on area employers and especially on our middle class?
You made comments on investments earlier, so we go back. It was interesting what you said was being in where the
Right, I
investments
mean,
were.
Industry 4.0, which is really the automation, the technology implementing into the manufacturing process, is here and continues to grow in our region. I think what's really benefit us is having such a strong automation cluster nearby and having automation providers who can help our companies be cutting edge. And that's great from an employer perspective. I'm maybe a little bit concerned about the workforce that might be left behind, who hasn't adapted to that technology and the change in how it can impact their work. And so I kind of talked about earlier that you're going to need education beyond a high school degree to keep up with technology and the pace. As much as I consider myself technology savvy, right now I'm still handing my phone to my 13-year-old and saying, I can't figure this out, and he fixes it. But the millennials are so much more intuitive with technology too, so it is a big shift that we've got to continue to try to keep up. I can't give them my phone anymore.
Yeah. Well, and one of the comments has been in these different models, with whether it's Slack or secular or stagnation, whatever it is that employers are consistently deciding to invest in like upgrading software and a host of other things that they might not have invested in the same way 10 or 20 years ago, and it changes the dynamic of employment.
Right, when you can't find talent, you look to automate, and automation involves someone with very advanced skills to operate that automation equipment. It's not someone right out of high school, whose job was replaced and can take it over. So it requires a whole level of skill sets that many in our workforce may not have and need to get.
So I don't know if the question is, are we going to become robots, or are robots going to take over? But I think it kind of has this sentiment of what exactly is happening in terms of automation and its impact on the economy.
This is such an imponderable. It really is, and I'm not sure you could have asked a bigger, more open-ended question for us. But in some ways, it's a continuation of what's been happening in U.S. manufacturing over the last 70 years. We're all familiar with the fact that the share of manufacturing in U.S. employment has fallen steadily since the mid-1950s. It's down around 12% now of the U.S. workforce is engaged in manufacturing. But that's been accompanied by this gigantic increase in productivity to the point where the real level of U.S. manufacturing output right now is higher than it's ever been. We're in 2019, we hit another maximum, another record in terms of the real value of what we produced in manufacturing. So I think Jennifer's point about technical education in the region is really, really important. I think, I'm a college professor, and I hate to say this, but I think the relative value of post-high school technical education, technical certification, and technical associate's degrees is rising relative to the value of a straight traditional BA degree. I think it's going to be really important that West Michigan be ready to spend in enhancing all kinds of post-high school technical education.
And I think going back to housing costs, why are housing costs so high is because the skilled trades who can help build the house, the electricians, the pipe fitters, the plumbers, they're in such short supply, raises housing costs up. So if we can increase our pipeline of professionals in that area, our region will really gain. And by the way, electricians making a whole heck of a lot of money than someone with a 4-year degree in psychology coming out of there with little education, but more hands-on. So.
Well, it's definitely impacted the applied learning requirements in college. I don't know if it's really impacted the vocational ideas students have in their mind about what they might go might go do. And if anybody's tried to do a remodel of their house or build a house, I don't know if you've figured this out, they won't start on Monday. and if they start on Monday, they're going to use subs that came from someplace else besides here that they don't know, and you might get them to work for a week, and then they're going to come back. They're trying to move resources around and try to understand how to get those things done. And it is a reflection of this lack of that technical part of the workforce as well. Let's take another question. See one at the back.
All right, coming your way. Want me to do a little song and dance? I don't know about that.
Didn't have to walk that far. Tom with Gordon Water Systems. As we're standing, I'm standing, January of 2020, and it's economic forecast. You're sitting here 2021. 1% growth?
Yeah.
2% growth?
Close.
What's the forecast?
That's our closer.
That's your specialty. Come on.
Well, I think this is almost, but not quite the time. But we're going to shift to forecast in a moment. So we'll pump the brakes for a moment, and we'll come back to that.
We're still deciding.
Yeah.
We're still thinking about it.
We're trying to read consumer sentiment right now in the
I
auditorium.
was polling the room before it started, so, you know.
We're watching how you're seated and leaning forward or backwards. Here's
I think
another
Britt's
one.
got one over there. Is this working now? Yep.
There we go.
Thank you for your panel discussion. Dean Whitaker with Whitaker Associates. I guess it's more of a local question, but what does the acquisition of JR Automation mean to the community by Hitachi? And we're looking at a $1.4 billion investment in our region, and how can we maximize the benefit of that investment?
It's a great question. Myself and Jane were actually invited last week to the town hall meeting with all JR employees right here in the Civic Center, and got a front row seat to really see that new relationship, which we think it's going to be incredibly positive. JR, you know, most companies go through a life cycle of growth. JR started as a startup in a garage, they went to a higher stage, got purchased by a private equity firm, and now that technology and what they offer was so attractive to Hitachi that they wanted to form a partnership. We heard great things about continuing to keep the JR model strong and consistency, so we're excited about building that relationship. And you know, we have a lot of international firms here who really help drive our economy. LG Chem is one of our largest employers as well, out of Korea. We have Yangfeng, who is from China. And so we have to embrace that as a region and welcome those international employers. But I think it's also really important as our companies go through certain lifestyle changes or life cycle changes that we're continuing to build a strong base of startups and growing our own companies to from the early stage to the mature stage. So we are really all in on our surge efforts to help those companies, those new companies, to continue to grow and develop. So we need to kind of be tending all phases of the garden, working with Hitachi in their headquarters in Japan, keeping them strong, but also growing the next JR Automation of the future. And that's what will keep our economy strong.
Well, we continue to be noted by these organizations that will assess what are the best small cities in the United States to start a business. We end up #1 in some of them year after year. And if you look at the measures of that, there's some of them are things you'd expect. It's a good place to start because the cost of running the business, the resources, is lower than in other cities. The cost of real estate, a host of other things. It's not because we're a hub. It's not because we become a hub. It's not because this is where you have rivals on some of the other cities. But it's also the way these communities, when you look at the others, handle generational money and how well that money's been reinvested in the community, which we have lots of successes for that. But whether we've fostered a risk-taking enough culture where people will see ways to start new things here in this community versus on the retirement side, a lower cost, lower risk place to move to at the end of retirement, can you simultaneously create a culture that is entrepreneurial?
Yeah, and I think the balance of getting the retirees in to help and support the startups as well is going to be important. So we have a mentor program to connect startups with our established talents. I think having strong base core downtowns are important too for our traction. Look, people have to drive to get here. We are not a pass-through part of the state of Michigan, but once we get them here, they don't want to leave, which is a great thing. And so if we can create an environment, if you as a talented individual who don't want to relocate, say your company wants you to, and can create your own startup and innovate and grow, will be strong. So we've got to keep the talent regardless of who signs the paycheck, and our team works daily to make sure that happens. In the last recession, we had a lot of established individuals who didn't want to relocate, and they created startup companies, and those companies are continuing to grow strong. We have to keep that life cycle going.
Good question.
Got another one.
Okay.
Hi, Jim Berry from Caldwell Banker Woodland Schmidt. We've enjoyed a long, steady recovery. Interest rates have remained surprisingly low. Be very interested in your forecast for interest rates in the new year here.
Maybe we pivot now to talking about going forward. What are expectations on interest rates going forward? I mentioned earlier, everybody thought we were going to go to 4%. We'd recover kind of like most recoveries. That's not what has happened.
Right. Well, my personal view on interest rates is I think for the coming year anyway, they're going to be fairly stable. I don't think we're going to see any big changes at the federal level in terms of the Federal Reserve. They cut rates, surprisingly to me, in 2019, and I think they're going to leave them alone for the time being. I think they like where they are right now, and so interest rates could come down a little bit. I think the mortgage rate, conventional mortgage rate, could come down just a little bit over the next year. Nothing dramatic, but so overall, some stability over the next year in interest rates.
I think Jay's exactly right about that. I think interest rates stay low for the coming year. Ben Bernanke, the former head of the Fed, made an important speech earlier this month, which I think shed some light on it. He argued that even without cutting interest rates, which is hard now, they're so low, even without cutting interest rates, the Fed still has the ability to deliver the equivalent stimulus to a 3 percentage point cut in interest rates using alternative monetary policy measures. I think that was a really important announcement. I think if the Fed had to stimulate the economy at some point this year, they would do it without cutting interest rates. And
talk a little more about that. So
they've got other tools. They've got, they can buy assets from banks and indeed from all other kinds of financial institutions and pay for them by simply increasing banks' reserves in the Federal Reserve System. That injects resources into the system, but without directly changing interest rates. It's more quantitative easing, basically, could happen.
And so, go ahead.
Basically, what they did to help us get out of the Great Recession. Interest rates were practically zero.
Yeah.
And so we couldn't go any lower. So they couldn't
like
stimulate
negative interest rates? We saw some experimentation with that. It's interesting.
So they used the quantitative easing to help pull us out of the recession. So.
Exactly right, and I think correctly, our Fed has given no signal that it's interested in pushing interest rates negative. It just doesn't seem to want to follow that European model.
So I'll shift from interest rates to this other. So let's talk about externalities for just a minute. The kind of things that would disrupt our economy and cause us to have something happen that is somewhat unpredictable. So we have political uncertainty. We have uncertainty with we have an announcement for what we think is going to happen for a deal with China. When I hear it's done, it's done. But we have uncertainty in terms of the Middle East. We have a lot of the things, war, trade wars, political uncertainty, all these things can cause disruptions that will always, Jay, tell me if you don't agree with them, always are what cause us to move away from where we think we're headed economically. So are there any particular externalities you think that, even if we had the most glowing outlook, what's most threatening that would make us be suspect to having a disruption?
So from our perspective, when the last election was up in the air, we saw a big amount of our employers saying, I'm not investing anything, I'll wait and see who is in the Oval Office. And then after that, and the tax reform came in, there was a significant investment boom. So anytime there's uncertainty politically or major business tax changes, we're going to save our money.
We're going to pause.
No,
Yep.
no hiring, no investment.
I think trade still is kind of out there. This is phase one. That means there's got to be a phase two, right? What's phase two going to look like, and when is it going to come? And so there's uncertainty there, and I think trade wars are nasty, and they can really disrupt things.
Uncertainty might feel like a really vague thing, but in recent decades, the research division of the U.S. Federal Reserve Board has been developing measures of uncertainty, and they've discovered that you actually can put a number on uncertainty, make an index of it, and I'm here to tell you that we are living in a moment where those uncertainty indices on trade policy and on tax policy and other policies are at their highest levels. And those make a real difference in investment. Just the trade policy uncertainty alone is estimated to have caused a substantial reduction in overall U.S. investment this past year. Now Jay's right. The trade policy uncertainty may be easing a bit now. The new U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement has passed. For a while there, this past year, it looked like it might not make it. The phase one deal with the Chinese is in place. All that's good. The wild card internationally, I think, is that the Chinese economy is slowing down. Officially, the Chinese say their growth rate is 6% now, maybe a tick less than 6%. What I'm hearing unofficially is that China's growth may already be as low as 2 or 3%. We know for a fact that auto sales have fallen dramatically in China. I think if China has a bad year, that's the potential for something that would upset our own economic fortunes. And how ironic would that be if GM and Ford's dropping sales in China were a harbinger of a recession for us?
Well, let's go to final comments about the economy. As was noted, we're not trying to avoid talking about the forecast, but to understand the future, you have to understand what's happened up to date and to understand what that might lead to. So Jennifer, let's start with you. What would be your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, I would say 2020 forecast stable sales, small growth, incremental growth. Locally, where I see continual boom and expansion would be in the food processing and automation sector, given talent and really the rest of the world needs food. The majority of our growth will come from companies with less than 100 employees. That's just how it works US-wide, so we'll continue to see small growth and expansions. We have about 40 projects right now in our pipeline, so our pipeline hasn't slowed down, but we're seeing more and more companies say stable sales, not decrease, but stable.
Okay. Jay or Steve?
I'll go first. Okay. First, there's I got about 4 factors here that are going to influence where we are this current year. One is continuation of the tight labor market. That means jobs won't be growing quite as fast as we'd like, maybe, because it's just a tight labor market. That'll help slow growth down a little bit. Easing of the trade war with China is a positive. That will help us. We had an interest rate cut in 2019 by the Federal Reserve. The impact of that cut should come to fruition during 2020. That'll give us a little boost that we wouldn't have otherwise had. And then during the first half of the year, there's going to be the hiring of temporary census workers nationally, and that'll help boost employment during the first half of the year. Now, the labor market's already tight, but I think a lot of the people that are going to get to work for the census are people like me that maybe have dropped out for a while anyway, are going to come back in and help the census, or people that feel like they're underemployed and need a little more income will help work on the census too. But there will be a boost in employment because of the census, so that's be positive news during 2020. But overall, I'm a numbers guy. I did forecasts for the last 30 years, so I pulled up one of my favorite forecasts, and I'll just use it again here today.
1993?
Yeah, something like that. It was a good year. Yeah. No, but in terms of the national economy, real GDP, in 2019, it looks like it grew about 2.3%. And I think in 2020, it'll continue to grow right around 2%. Not a big change, pretty stable there. The unemployment rate averaged probably close to 3.7% in 2019. I think it'll come down a little bit, maybe 3.5%, because I think, again, the labor market is going to continue to tighten a little bit there. Inflation will remain low, probably below 2%. Light vehicle sales have been pretty steady and strong, around 17 million units for the US. I think they'll remain in that neighborhood over the coming year. In terms of Michigan, the key variable again is payroll employment, and I think it hasn't been growing real strong. The pace has slowed the last couple of years, and we grew by 25,000 jobs in 2019. I think we'll grow somewhere between 28,000, 30,000 jobs in 2020. And Michigan's unemployment rate I expect also to decline slightly. Looks like it was about 4.1% in 2019. It'll probably edge back down to about 3.9% in 2020. So.
Very good. Stephen.
Our current president is himself a force for uncertainty.
Doesn't matter which side you're on.
That's just a fact. But interestingly, if it looked like Warren or Sanders was going to win the presidency come October and in November, that would also be a big force for uncertainty in the economy. So I'm gonna just take a stab at this and say 2% growth for the U.S. this coming year seems about right. Thank you.
So I'll make one last.
Mic drop.
Yeah, it's gone. I'll throw one follow-up here. We mentioned this growth in the stock market. We know that the stock market is not the economy. You know there's relationship here, but when you look at this growth this last year, all I can think is everything regresses to the mean. I mean, when you look at the chart over time, it's just it seems unlikely there would be significant growth that even resembled anything that happened this year. In fact, there'd be some settling. Is that any reactions to that?
Stock market is so hard to predict. If I could
I'm
predict,
asking you to.
yeah, if I could predict the stock market, I wouldn't have been a government economist for 30 years.
What's your prediction, Stacy?
I think everything returns to the mean. So I think that there will be some settling, and so nobody's thinking it's going to be dramatic unless we have some externality that causes this to happen in some way. But it seems unrealistic. We have this false measure, right? January 1 to December 31. And 2010 to 2020. This is totally random. We might as well have picked March 7th, or we could have picked 2003. We like to think in these decades, but the idea that somehow that wasn't still substantially part of recovery is hard to manage. So I would think soberly and not predict 29% growth next year.
I would not do that. Right.
Correct.
Yes.
It'll be interesting too to just see how the election affects the stock market.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's back to an externality where uncertainty may cause something to change dramatically. And that gets to my son's question: should I just hide my money until December 1, right? I won't give you my answer to him for that, but all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.